I'll start with some boring stuff in order to gain some time so that the next speaker also gets a bit of a changeover time. So it's a little bit of a rush, but I'll do my best to stay in my time window. So writing the elevator, domain-driven design in the Penthouse, what does that mean? Let me ask you a question. Who has read Gregor Hohpe's book, The Software Architect Elevator? Give me a sign. Okay. Who knows about domain-driven design? Quite a few folks. So basically, my talk will a lot be about connecting dots together. And I'll briefly introduce myself. My name is Michael Plöd. I work for a company called InnoQ. I'm basically a consultant and a trainer who grew up in the area of software architecture and domain-driven design. And there is a guy called Gregor Hohpe who wrote a book back in the days about enterprise architecture, integration patterns, which was quite famous. And he came up with a new book quite some time ago, I would say 2 years or 3 years, where he pitched the idea of a software architect elevator. And the key message of this book is, as a software architect, you're supposed to communicate with various stakeholders. Take your organization as a big skyscraper. So if you take a look at La Défense in Paris, where all the big office buildings is, many larger organizations are hierarchical. There is the engine room, where stuff is being run and maintained and being built, and where people are operating systems and stuff like that. And on the other hand, you have the penthouse apartments up there, where the high folks are residing with a strategic and wide view over many things. And Gregor says, hey, you should treat your organization like that. As an architect, you should travel with the elevator in that building and be able to communicate on various levels with that. And if you're doing a good job, if the penthouse gets interested in some stuff from the engine room, and if the engine room starts to incorporate some of the strategic thinking of the penthouse in their day-to-day work. And a quote by Gregor, I need to look at one of my slides now, is in the book is modern architects align organization and technology. They reduce friction and chart transformation journeys. In addition to working with UML and architecture styles, such architects ride the architect elevator from the penthouse, where the business strategy is set, to the engine room, where the enabling technologies are implemented. They shun popular buzzwords in favor of a clear strategy defined by conscious decision-making. So that's one quote from that book. And let's take a look at some of these topics that are being discussed in this penthouse. Make or buy decisions, how to make an organization more agile, how to structure teams, how to transform legacy applications or application landscapes, how to transform an organization into a product-driven digital organization, stuff like that. So that's one part. And then we have our well-known domain-driven design thing. Domain-driven design will become 20 years old this year. I'm not talking about new stuff, so about quite some old stuff. And what are typical topics in the DDD space? I would say that's domain modeling, identifying boundaries, mostly for software, but nowadays with the socio-technical DDD stuff, also for teams, about strategic classifications, for subdomains like core subdomains, generic subdomains, and so on, like context mapping, where we talk about the contact between systems, bounded context, but also on an organizational and communication dynamics level between teams. And what I want to do in this talk is give you a hint and show you how you can use stuff from the DDD space for this communication task towards your management, for instance. So I hope that you get away with some stuff where you can talk to your leadership using some of the techniques from the DDD space. Yeah, so wait a minute, I need to allow that. Maybe this one works. So what I will start off with some ideas in this talk, some stuff you usually hear from management folks and so on. So, but please don't worry, I don't want to transform you into a suit-wearing enterprise software engineer or something like that with a tie or something. That's not my intention. But I will just throw some quotes that usually come from the leadership, from the Penthouse, and I will show you how you can work with those quotes based on some stuff from your software architecture and especially from your DDD world. So one thing we very often hear, and Gregor said that architects shun buzzwords. I will have a bunch of buzzwords, especially in the Penthouse quotes. Yeah? So let's start with the following quote. We start an agile transformation. How can we do modeling, design, and requirements engineering in this scenario? So whose organization is nowadays in an agile transformation? No one. Oh, quite a few. Okay. How's that going? Laughter, I see. I understand. So usually I would pinpoint you on the next slide to a GitHub repository called Domain-Driven Design Crew, which is a GitHub organization where quite a few active folks from the Domain-Driven Design community, also a bunch of speakers here, like for instance, Nick Thune, Maxime from the organizers, props to the organizers here, and I really mean that for setting up such a great conference. Quite a few folks who speak here contribute to that. And there is one repository called the DDD starter modeling process. And this can be a good starting point for all of your DDD work. And there is, I would say, one thing in this starter modeling process, and I would say everyone who has some familiarity with domain-driven design knows that iterations, continuous learning, continuously improving a design are core cultural principles of domain-driven design. When customers ask me, hey, what is domain-driven design? I always say there's three major parts. There is this well-known tactical design, which is very much targeted at lower leveling domain modeling, software engineering, and stuff like that. And strategic design, where we identify subdomain boundaries, bounded context boundaries, and classifications. We will talk a lot about strategic DDD in this talk as well. But there is also one thing that very often gets overlooked by many folks. That's the cultural implication of DDD. All this collaboration, all this continuous learning, all these iterations. So one of the key messages for this, in terms of this quote, in terms of the agile transformation, hey, take a look. There are ideas in domain-driven design, this collaborative modeling stuff, this working in iterations. So I would say one of the first steps in terms of going agile would be to start adding in iterations to your day-to-day work, but not just for the software development process, but by making those iterations larger and larger and larger. So maybe there is a fit for that in there. So when you check, for instance, a good starting point is the Agile Manifesto, the good old Agile Manifesto. There are a bunch of principles in there. And so when we match them, for instance, one idea is, one of the principles behind the Agile Manifesto is, for instance, business peoples and developers must work together daily throughout the project. Does that ring a DDD bell in your heads? I would say it should. Definitely, absolutely. Or build projects around motivated individuals. Give them the environment and support they need and trust them to get the job done. If you take a look at quite a few of the DDD conferences out there, like DDD Europe, Kandinsky, and so on, there are very often sessions about psychological safety in those collaborative modeling workshops. Thank you. Big round of applause. So now you see where you're. No, not yet. my keynote, perfect. That looks good. My keynote is still in remote working mode. but it no longer is. So we have a slide. So what I have here is the Agile Manifesto quoted with some ideas from the DDD space. So you see that there are quite a few things where we have a lot of parallels in common. Yeah, for instance, continuous attention to technical excellence and good design enhances agility. Who has read the Supple Design chapter of Eric Evans' Blue Book? Anyone remembers that one? I would say that is one of the most underrated chapters in Eric's book. That's a really great chapter, which absolutely addresses those things. Also, there are a couple of things in the Agile Manifesto that talk about stuff that the DDD community doesn't address. Fair enough. But there is a really huge overlap in these things. Yeah? So I would say, given this Penthouse message, hey, we want to do an Agile transformation. How do we model stuff? There is a pretty neat fit here. Yeah? So the key message for the Penthouse is that domain-driven design thrives in an agile environment and suffers heavily in a waterfall. I very often compare that to a fancy car. I'm not so much into cars, so you can't really impress me with a car. Yeah, I'm more into, like, you could impress me with Leica cameras maybe, but not cars. But I would say for the majority of the people, many people think that a Porsche is a fancy car. And I would say, okay, if you do DDD in a waterfall process, it may look from the outside fancy as a Porsche, but as soon as you hit the gas pedal, you hit the pedal to the metal, you realize, oh, there's just a lawnmower motor in there. It drives, but it's not fun. It's not what you would expect. So I would say DDD only is able to deliver upon its promises when it's run in an agile environment. Another quote from the Penthouse: we are business-driven. Everyone knows it. We're business. Business focus is really important for us. So, and this is, by the way, this DDD starter modeling process, which I just mentioned. And you see there are quite a few of iterations. And there is one part of that process which doesn't have necessarily to do a lot with core DDD stuff, but which is still interesting. That is aligning the business model and the user needs. So a question you could raise to the Penthouse is, or a question that I very often ask architects in the organizations of my customer is, hey, what's the business model of your application? What's its value proposition? What are the customer segments? What's the cost structure? How do you earn money? Which revenue streams do exist? So very often, I get the answer, Michael, that is a really good question. Let me think about that. So do your architects in the organization really understand the business model? Those of you who are familiar with DDD know that domain-driven design is also a lot about aligning things together. Yeah, very often we want to align a business architecture to software architecture or to an organization. But how aligned is the view of the business model among the stakeholders in the organization? So do we have a shared understanding of the business model for a certain product, for a certain application, for an app, or whatever you may have in the organization? So what I do there, and that's also recommended, a technique that's recommended in this DDD startup modeling process, I sometimes go ahead and hand a business model canvas to various stakeholders and tell them, hey, take half an hour time or an hour time and fill that out for me. Yeah? And then I compare, what did the software engineers come up with? What did the testers say? What's the perspective of the business? What's the perspective of the project management, of the senior management, and so on, of the architects? And in 80% of the cases, I see quite a bit of a misalignment there. How can we be successful in software when we don't even have an alignment on the business model? I would say that's hard. Now, let me ask you a question. Who is working in an organization where this buzzword digitalization is being tossed around heavily? Here, digitalization, here, digitalization. What is digitalization? What's the purpose of digitalization from a business perspective? What do you think?
Reduce costs.
Reduce costs. Okay, fair enough. That's a correct answer. Another idea. Hire consultants. Yeah, that's good for me. No. Okay. Pardon? Yeah? Let me generalize that. I think there are two perspectives on that purpose. Improve an existing business model with tech. I would say this lowering costs, which was mentioned on the left side over there, is one of those ideas. So you have an existing business model, and you add some technology to make it faster, more cost-effective, or whatever. So you have an existing business, and you improve it with the usage of technology. By making response times faster, by making it more fancier, more accessible, whatever you may choose. The next thing is that you use technology to enable a brand new business model. I would say that this last thing, we will see a lot of that happening with all the AI, large language model stuff, and so on in the next years. I think there will be completely new business models which are being enabled by the usage of tech. But did you realize one detail here? Both purposes mention business and tech. Now, how can we be successful here if we don't have a collaboration between business and tech? And don't be the company that produces my pressure washer for my terrace, who went ahead and said, install our pressure washer app. I got curious, why would I do that? So I installed it. So I was able to remote control my pressure washer with an app on my iPhone. Yeah, of course. So I'm on my terrace, there's a lot of dirt. I'm pressure washing, and I want to change the power of the pressure washer. Yes, I'm going to pull out my over 1,000 euro expensive smartphone and deal with it among all the dirt and stones and water flying around. Great idea. I think that's an absolutely new business model, but I think more for Apple than for them. So let's introduce DevOps. Let's do that. That's a great idea to drive that stuff. Now, let's take a look at it. So I would say DevOps is a lot about a collaboration between, and please see that as skill sets, what I'm describing now. Yeah? Collaboration between operational skills and development and architecture skills. Yeah? A very popular saying in this area is, you built it, you run it. Great idea, sounds good on a bunch of PowerPoint slides, stuff that you can impress people with. Now, if the stuff that you built doesn't match your value proposition or doesn't solve any problems of users or your customers, I think you can do as much DevOps as you want. But it will always be quite a bit of, well, nice. I will get very buzzwordy now. Let's add another kind of collaboration to that picture. Let's add domain expert knowledge and collaborate with them as well, using some of the domain-driven design techniques. I would say if we do something like that, we can change that DevOps slogan a little bit towards you design it, you run it, and you built it. So I would say, isn't that the idea of a cross-functional team? I would say, yeah, it quite is. A technique that I very often use for leadership people to visualize where their organization currently is an infographic by a company called Amplitude. Now, and what you see there is those gray boundaries here. Yeah, so this stuff over there, those are team boundaries. Those gray arrows are external handovers. So I hand stuff over from one team to another. We have a coordination. They need to be in a meeting and all that stuff. The yellow thing is within the boundary of a team. The pink arrow is, let's say, both of us, we're in a team, and I say, hey, please, I'm done with that. Please, you continue. That's faster. team internal coordination, less friction. Yeah, and then we have stuff that is happening in an iteration. I would say when quite a few of the managers say we want to do an agile transformation or stuff, they think about, or I hope they think about, moving down that ladder, yeah, pushing their delivery organization to one of those last steps down there. But that requires, yeah, if we move the responsibilities, the teams need to be enabled to do so. Yeah? So the tech folks need a better understanding of the business, as well as the business needs a better understanding of the tech. So please, dear developers, don't get me wrong. So there's very often the saying, oh, as a development team, you now need to do this. You need to do DevOps. Oh, you need to build security right in. Let's do DevSecOps. Oh, data mesh. DevSec data ops, yeah, and now DevSec biz data whatever ops. Yeah, where do we want to end up? I think it's a lot about that enabling, and there is something in the DDD space that especially addresses that. Yeah, let me ask you a question: what goes into production? The knowledge of the domain experts, or stuff that is written in specifications, or the interpretation of that which is in the heads of the developers? Of course, the latter one goes into production, as Alberto Brandolini said, who's the inventor of a method called event storming. Now, we could ask the question, what could possibly go wrong there? This is obvious stuff, for sure. Let me give you a nasty example. So, how would many people call these things in that hotel room? A TV, a window, a desk, a painting, a chair, trolley. Obvious, for sure. Now let me be a little bit of evil. Yeah? I forgot my red blinking horns. Sometimes I bring them, but I forgot them at home. Let's imagine we implement this hotel room as a code base. What do we see in code? We see terms like transparency factory, decorator input, entertainment provider singleton, work enablement device, rollable stuff container, REST provider. You're laughing. I was in a fashion retail store 4 years ago and asked them, hey, do you have this pair of jeans in my size in a different shop? Can you look that up? And they started to talk behind the counter about terms like, well, you need to click on the tab T_FIL_ whatever. And I was like, what's going on there? Took a look. Oh, mainframe UI. So I had the assumption that they were talking about database table names from the DB2 database on the mainframe. Funny enough, that organization became a customer of my employer 2 years later, and I was able to verify that, and unfortunately, I was right. So the language of the DB2 database on the mainframe was leaking to the fashion shop floor. Yeah? Imagine Champs-Élysées, someone talking about DB2 stuff. Interesting. So what do quite a few organizations do? Let's add requirements engineering to the game. So we have a requirements engineering team who translates technical language to business language to technical language. So in Germany, I'm from Germany, we have a child birthday game where we line up 10 children next to each other and we whisper a story into the ear of one child. And they start whispering that story further, and further. And in the end, everyone loves what kind of nonsense comes out of that. Strangely, the same thing sometimes happens in software project, but no one loves there. So Marty McKagan, author of really great books, once said, if you're just using your engineers to code, you're only getting about half the value. Because the source of the best product and feature ideas are, on the one hand, direct customer feedback and team brainstorming. Team brainstorming includes collaboration. So that means don't hire a guy like me who is a consultant, yeah, who's down there, to get you product ideas. That wouldn't be the best idea. Yeah? I would never want to do that. So what should you propose to the Penthouse there? In the DDD space for these talks, there are a bunch of now great ideas for collaborative modeling techniques, stuff like domain storytelling, event storming, event modeling, stuff that stemmed from the DDD community. But we also, from the community, take a look at what other communities are doing, like the Agile product development community with the user story mapping technique. Great book, by the way, by Jeff Patton. Or example mapping from the behavior-driven development community. So there are great ideas. Yeah. Now, one thing that you can do is ask the Penthouse, hey, are there already design thinking initiatives in the business? Yeah, very often business organizations, they love design thinking stuff. That's also a collaborative thing, mostly targeted at business folks. And if they say yes, you can initially right away jump in and say, hey, we've got some ideas for workshops in this context. Let us be a part of that very early on. Yeah. But also, is the organization prepared for that direct collaboration? Yeah, I have been facilitating an event storming quite some time ago, where the manager said, oh, we want to check out that method. That looks really interesting. We want to check it out. So there were their employees, their people working for them at the event storming board. The managers, they were standing back there. And very often, I see people going back and forth between the managers and the board, the managers and the board. So some folks went ahead and had their sticky notes signed off by the managers. So I kicked out all of the managers from the workshop. Well, I had a meeting after that. But that was worth it. Yeah. Now let me come up with another quote from the Penthouse. We want to become a tech-enabled product organization. Boom, buzzword level explodes through the roof. What does that mean? Yeah. So tech is a core strategic asset in that context. We don't want to have any more feature factories that give you a bonus for Jira tickets solved or at least closed or claimed to be closed. Yeah? And we have a strong aim for insourcing. Nick Thune, who's doing a presentation tomorrow, once came up with the idea of an innovation cycle. So we have teams that take a look at the market, what's happening there. The market always expects a better user experience. So if you ask folks at German car makers, and I guess also at French car makers, how often they now get asked about over-the-air update capabilities with software in their cars, I think they will say, oh, stop. Yeah, it's getting overhand. Yeah? We're being asked that a lot. And a lot of that stuff is being enabled by software, which is being built by the teams. In the Agile community, there is a great guy called Alan Hohpe. If you don't follow Alan on Twitter, do that. It's quite entertaining at some times, but also packed with wisdom. And what Alan said in this thing is, so first of all, it's obvious from this slide that the software needs to change. It needs to adapt. And Alan said that we need to ramp that up on a solid foundation that can accommodate that change. And that can only be the domain. So if you model the software according to the domain, you can more easily handle changes to the domain. Sounds abstract, but let me assure you, no one in the business wakes up in the morning at 8 a.m. or 7 a.m., I don't know when they get up, and says, today I'm going to torture some poor developer souls with ridiculous requirements. No one is going to do that in the business. So their requirements that they raise stem from their perspective, from their mental model. So it's probably a good idea to understand that. So what Alan says is, the software architect should be a model of the business domain. Now, there is another book out there, Accelerate, which is now a little bit old, I would say 4 years, 5 years old. And what they found out in a study about highly effective delivery organizations is that a loosely coupled software architecture with a matching organizational structure is a key predictor for continuous delivery performance and the ability to scale organization and increase performance in a linear fashion. So what they basically said is something like that. So for tech-enabled organizations, those are things that you want to do. And this is exactly what strategic domain-driven design addresses to a high degree. Yeah? Or from a different perspective, when we talk about this product thinking perspective, product-driven perspective, yeah? Nathan Katakam wrote in his great blog post about what product thinking basically means, that product thinking is the journey from the problem space of the users to the solution space of the business. The goal of this journey is to reduce the gap between users and the business. Now, let's build up on that. I'm just connecting dots here. Domain-driven design talks about problem space and solution space. So in problem space, we have the domains and the subdomains. Or how Matthias Verrage and Rebecca Versbrock said, domains live in the problem space. They are how an organization perceives its areas of activity and expertise. I would say there is a great fit into that world from the DDD space. Now, when we want to drill that deeper and we want to decompose a problem, which is basically a big problem to solve, so a domain, a big problem to solve, into smaller things, we break that down to subdomains. And what the DDD community also pitches here is do that in a collaborative fashion, do it together with the business. Don't just say, okay, that's the application, and now build some modules as microservices. No, let's get a shared understanding between the business and the tech side to come up with that. Now, let's leave it at that for a second, and let's come up with a next quote from the Penthouse. Let's go all in software as a service and the cloud. And you see the buzzword level on those slides is a bit high. There's also a thing in there in domain-driven design for those ideas. We have this strategize phase, for instance, in the DDD starter modeling process, which is tailored at categories for subdomains. Now, DDD comes with 3 categories for subdomains. Core, which are very strategically relevant for you. This is where you want to have a high degree of differentiation, which you want to maintain over a longer amount of time. Generic, which is something like the necessary evil thing. Well, we need to do that, we know, but we have no aims at differentiating ourselves against the competition. So let me ask you a question. How high is your passion for your travel expense stuff in your organization? Not. Who loves their travel expense system? No one. So there's obviously no folks working at a SaaS provider for travel expense systems. So mostly users. So let me assume, for most of you, no organization, none of your employers differentiates over travel expenses. I hope so. Unless you're building a SaaS platform for travel expenses, then you should. But that's the only exception. And then we have the supporting subdomains, which are somewhere in the middle. There is a technique called core domain charts, where you can ask that question. How differentiating is some stuff, and how complex is that? And I would highly give you the recommendation to drive that discussion from this perspective. Don't ask your folks, hey, what is core and what is not core? Because then you will always argue against stuff not being core. Because everyone wants everything to be core. You have a highly political discussion which leads nowhere. This stuff helps, And I once heard an interesting quote by a C-level manager at a large German bank. He said, "We are a bank and not a software shop," to pitch their outsourcing strategy 15 years ago. Well, that didn't go down well. So I think they're now insourcing again. But that was a quote that I heard. So let me ask, in this context, some explicit questions for the Penthouse. How are your teams staffed in those areas? So where are your internal developers working? Where aren't they working? So what I very often see in many organizations is that the internal developers and engineers are working in that area down there. And up there you have highly paid external consulting teams running around, implementing the really business critical stuff. I work as a consultant, and I say very clearly that shouldn't be the case. I would highly advise against that. What I would rather say is move your internal teams up there to the core stuff, because there you have the real ownership of things. So there is a real sense of ownership of those things. Or you can also discuss that from a make or buy perspective as well. So I would say stuff that is core should be something that you should write on your own. So a very extreme example, for instance, is Tesla. They even went ahead and started implementing their own hardware for certain things in the software part in order to be independent. Yeah? So that's also a perspective on that. And in terms of standard custom off-the-shelf software or software as a service stuff, let me discuss that on the example of SAP. What I very often say when I write that elevator to leadership positions, I say in generic subdomains, I would just, for instance, take SAP and do stuff the way that SAP says this stuff should be done. And I wouldn't customize a lot in that area. In the supporting subdomains, I would start customizing some things, yeah? I would, for instance, in generic, I would change my processes, probably. In the supporting area, I wouldn't change the processes. I would customize a little bit, but stop with the customization as soon as something gets core. Then start writing that stuff on your own. So how could you, in Germany, we say standard software. The English term is usually custom off-the-shelf software. How would you, but I like this standard software thing. How can you differentiate on something that is standard software? By over-ambitious customization, which will block you off upgrade paths in the future, probably, or you at least run the risk. Another buzzword quote. We want agile cross-functional teams which are autonomous and which can deliver fast. Let's just do microservices and we'll be fast. Really? Are you sure? I doubt that. So let me enhance that quote by Matthias and Rebecca. Yeah? Bounded contexts are part of the solution space. They are deliberate design choices. As a systems designer, you choose those boundaries to manage the understandability of the system by using different models to solve different aspects of the domain. So I'm enhancing the problem space, and let's now move to the solution space. So what we want to have is a pretty good alignment between subdomains and bounded contexts in DDT space. And a definition for a bounded context, which I like quite a bit, is the following one. A bounded context is a boundary for a model expressed in a consistent, ubiquitous language tailored around a specific purpose. A technique, I will dwell down on that. So the interesting part is this tailored around a specific purpose. So I don't like black and white views on things. Yeah? So what I always say is about priorities. In a core domain, I would highly prioritize specialization of a model over reusability of a model. Yeah, I would rather have a certain purpose, which is super core to your business, and I would build a model that solves this purpose really well, in a brilliant fashion. If this is then reusable, cool. If it's not reusable, we can live with that for strategic reasons. A technique that can help you there, I'll just go in that as a quick hint. Please see that as a quick advice. So if you want to go down that path and design bounded context, there is a canvas technique called bounded context design canvas. Let me say one thing about those canvas techniques. In my eyes, they're not documentation tools. They're a helper for you to ask questions during a design process. So see them as a checklist. Did I think about the purpose of a context? Did I think about the ubiquitous language? Did I think about which rules, which business rules are located where? Did I think about the strategic classification? Are there any assumptions that I'm making in this design process? I think there is no design without assumptions. Write those assumptions down in an explicit fashion. So again, also this business model canvas is a checklist. Have you thought about the value proposition of a product? Have you thought about the customer segments, the channels, the cost structure, and so on and so forth? See them as a checklist and not as a documentation tool. Once you've done that, you have a neat thing for the documentation. Fair enough. Yeah? But when we want to go to those autonomous teams, there's this organize phase. And now we're leaving the DDD boundaries a little bit again. Yeah, there is a book called Team Topologies by Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pace. And they said, as part of their fracture planes for defining team boundaries, that bounded context can serve as a team first boundary. And what they talk a lot about is cognitive load. Yeah? And please, let me quickly go back to that quote by Rebecca and Matthias. We wanna use those boundaries to manage the understandability of the system. That goes hand in hand with that idea of cognitive load again. Yeah. So is a team within that boundary able to learn and master domain complexity? Are they able to conduct experiments in that boundary and still be able to deliver high-value software? If you answer all those questions with yes, yeah, you're sailing in a pretty decent direction. There's also this a lot of talk about autonomy. I don't like that term, to be honest, because autonomy means that teams have nothing to do with each other and that they can do whatever they want, and that's not what is actually meant. I would say it's a loose coupling on an organizational level what's being meant, that we reduce cross-team coordination, that we reduce the number of meetings, yeah? That we increase the amount of decisions that is being made within the boundary of a team. That's what is being meant there. And Daniel H. Pink wrote a book, Drive, about what is motivating us, what's motivating teams. And he said, well, it's basically autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And I think this purpose is part of the bounded context definition. So can we clearly define a purpose for a certain team? Can we make sure that a team is able to master the complexity in that boundary? Think about the last slide with the cognitive load. And I think by making good thoughts about those boundaries, yeah, I think we can move towards this autonomy between this loose coupling on an organizational level as well. Yeah, so if you have a really good thinking about those things, there's something that you can take a look at. Another hint, so if you want to go down this organizational path from a domain-driven design perspective, there's a bunch of interesting next steps. One is, of course, the team topology stuff, or Jürgen Appelow's unfixed model, which is actually an enhancement of the team topology stuff with some other stuff. Yeah? So there are many, many more dots we can connect here. And I'm honest, I could talk an hour about each of those models if I want. Yeah? Just as a hint, yeah, you can move further, yeah, with these things. But there's also something like that in the DDD space, context maps. Who knows about context maps in DDD? Give me a hand. Quite a few of those. This stuff is 20 years old. Yeah? Team topologies is 4 years old. I would say unfixed, 2 years something, 1 year, 2 year something roughly. Yeah? This stuff is 20 years old, and there are patterns that explicitly address team relationships. Yeah, like customer-supplier relationship, for instance. Yeah, about partnership, a published language, about the coupling of the software between teams. So I would say a very holistic view about these things can be delivered by the context map. You can also combine context maps with team topologies together. And this is stuff that I use very, very much to give names for the conversation with management folks. Yeah, so, hey, listen, those two teams, they're in a partnership. They need to spend a lot of time together. Yeah, so they can't be as autonomous. There is a breaker here in terms of their delivery speed because of cross-team coordination here. And some of those patterns, yeah, they imply that we need a high communication bandwidth between teams. So they will spend a lot of time in meetings, coordinating their tests, their releases, their stuff. And other patterns that say, well, there we have a low communication bandwidth. Yeah, so you can use these things as a means for communication with the penthouse of your organization. There is a lot of stuff in there. And from my experience, this really helps in the communication, and it gives you a good helper if you come. I would assume a lot of you folks come from a software perspective, software architecture, software engineering perspective. This is terminology that quite a few of you folks know, and this can help you to get you in those conversations. So when you've done that, the management will probably say, great, domain-driven design sounds like a silver bullet. That solves everything. Let's start a DDD initiative. No. I'm sorry, nothing in this talk was a silver bullet. Nothing. I'm really sorry to disappoint you. You need to find out what works for you. What are good ideas for you, for your organization? Every organization is different. Every organization is individual. Try these things out. Fail with it. Learn from the failure. That's how we want to work. And that's it from my side. Thank you very much. You can follow me on Twitter, wherever.